Good day. Today is Wednesday, 26th February 2025, and Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has now confirmed that there will indeed be a follow-up meeting between the Americans and the Russians, and it will take place tomorrow, Thursday, 27th February 2025, not in Riyadh, but in Istanbul. It's not clear who will be representing each country at these talks, but it will not be, or so it seems, any senior official, or at least it won't be Lavrov and Rubio. It will be conducted at a lower level, and the specific purpose of this meeting, apparently, is to arrange for the re-establishment of the embassies, the Russian embassy in Washington and the American embassy in Moscow. It's strange how this whole topic of the non-effective non-operation of the Russian and American embassies, the fact that neither country has an ambassador in the capital of the other, gets almost completely ignored in the Western media, even though, had it been true at any point in the Cold War, well, it would have rung massive alarm bells. Anyway, TASS has a long report about this. This is what Lavrov said. He said this over the course of a trip to Qatar. Such a meeting will take place in Istanbul tomorrow. We have announced that our diplomats and high-level experts will meet to address the systemic problems that have piled up as the result of the previous administration's illegitimate activities aimed at creating artificial obstacles for the work of the Russian embassy, to which we clearly responded in kind, also creating uncomfortable conditions for the operation of the US embassy in Moscow. And then Lavrov was at pains to make clear that the problem of Russia's frozen assets, which apparently somebody asked him about, has nothing to do with the operation of the embassies, because the asset issue is a state-level one. And Lavrov did, however, say that the Istanbul meeting would make clear how capable the parties are of moving forward quickly and effectively. So there we go. There's going to be a meeting tomorrow in Istanbul. It's a follow-up meeting to the meeting in Riyadh. It is, again, a bilateral meeting. It is being conducted at expert level between the Russians and the Americans, and the purpose will be limited to the topic of reopening the embassies. The American embassy, or not reopening, but rebuilding the embassies, the Russian embassy in Washington and the American embassy in Moscow. It continues to baffle me, incidentally, that there is still this assumption that at Riyadh, the Russians and the Americans talked about the details of a settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, and that this was the major topic of the discussion between Putin and Trump about 10 days ago now, when the Russians and the Americans have gone out of their way to deny that this was the case. It's been suggested, notably by John Helmer, an extremely incisive and indeed excellent analyst, and one very well informed about many matters, but he has said that as far as the Russians were concerned, the meeting in Riyadh was something of a train wreck, because the Americans didn't come forward with any clear plan about how they wanted to move forward in Ukraine. Sergei Ryabkov, the Russian deputy foreign minister, has also said that the Americans have never presented to the Russians anything that remotely resembles a plan about how to end the conflict in Ukraine. Well, if one is looking for a negotiation to settle the Ukrainian conflict and is expecting that the Americans and the Russians are going to negotiate it with each other, cutting out Ukraine entirely, then, well, that is not what the Russians and the Americans were about in Riyadh, or that they will be about in Istanbul. They made it very clear that they are seeking to normalize their relations, that this is their priority at the moment, and if negotiations do take place to settle the conflict in Ukraine, they must be conducted by the Ukrainians and the Russians, not by the Americans and the Russians. That is the Trump administration's policy, and given that this is so, they're not presenting a plan, because their plan is to get the Russians and the Americans to sit down and talk to each other. Up to now, that is all that there is. Of course, as the Russians and the Americans meet and talk over things, they may have more matters to discuss with each other with respect to Ukraine. The Russians have their own concerns, and they will be raising them with the Americans, and the Americans will have their own concerns also. But in terms of the issues in the conflict, the Americans have already taken the one step, which as far as the Russians are concerned, is the most important, which is that they have said that Ukraine will not be joining NATO after the conflict has ended. So the United States is not seeking to bring Ukraine into NATO anymore. Now, that is merely a verbal assurance or comment. It is not part of any deal. I've said already in previous programs that a treaty that required the United States to agree not to extend NATO membership to Ukraine at any future time is most unlikely to pass the Senate in the United States, and it's at the moment also the case that Ukraine President Zelensky continued to insist that Ukraine must either join NATO or must obtain security guarantees analogous to NATO membership, which, by the way, is also unacceptable to the Russians, as we will see shortly. But to reiterate again, other than that fact, that statement from the Americans that they have said that as far as they are concerned, NATO membership for Ukraine is not on the table, and that is final, at least as far as this administration is concerned. The Americans are not for the moment, and probably never will, be directly involved or directly engaged in a negotiation which they expect to happen between the Ukrainians and the Russians. Now, that is the American position. It's one that the Russians have broadly accepted for the moment as they work with the Americans to normalize relations. And the reopening of the embassies, or rather the bringing back of the embassies to a position of full operation with ambassadors in each country, is for the Russians an essential step forward. In fact, I remember some weeks ago, long before Trump and Putin spoke to each other, a Russian foreign ministry official, I believe it was Ryabkov, actually said that the first step that the United States needed to take if it was serious about improving relations with Russia was to sort out the mess that has been made about the diplomatic representation in each country, that each country has in the other. And that's the first step that is being taken now. Now, let's now turn to something else, which is the issue of the peacekeepers, because Lavrov had a great deal in the same news conference in Qatar to say about that. And he made it absolutely clear in the strongest terms that he has ever used up to this point, that he simply doesn't understand this whole topic of discussion about European peacekeepers in Ukraine, because the Russians do not agree to this and never will. And this is from the Russian news agency TASS. Peacekeeping force in Ukraine won't solve anything, Lavrov said. The approach promoted by the Europeans, that is first of all France as well as the British, is merely aimed at prolonging the conflict. And TASS then goes on to report Lavrov, saying, "We cannot and will not consider any such options." I don't know what Macron said about the deployment of European peacekeepers in Ukraine. He was not very convincing in Washington. But President Trump, when this issue was raised during the press conference, said, as far as I've read, that the decision to deploy peacekeepers can only happen if both sides agree to it, meaning, I suppose, us and Ukraine. But nobody consulted us on the matter. The approach promoted by the Europeans, that is first of all France, as well as the British, is aimed at prolonging the conflict and thwarting any attempts to de-escalate it. And then TASS reports Lavrov going on to say that Macron's approach envisages an immediate ceasefire and the deployment of peacekeepers, and only afterwards discussing territorial issues, what will happen to the people and other principles of settlement. This is nothing but trickery, and those are Lavrov's words. We cannot agree to a pause that is aimed at only one goal, to pump Ukraine with weapons again. And then Lavrov went on to say, any discussions about peacekeeping forces are null and void. The most important thing there is to eliminate the root causes of the conflict. They do not lie in the absence of peacekeeping forces. I have listed them already. Ukraine was being drawn into NATO for the purpose of further use of its territory for the creation of military infrastructure for use against Russia, as well as the systematic erosion of the rights of Russians and Russian speakers. What is left of Ukraine? Interesting choice of words, by the way. What is left of Ukraine should be freed from racist laws. There are also people there who find it easier to use Russian in everyday life, who want to preserve the traditions of their ancestors who grew up with Russian culture. Superficial measures like troop deployments won't be enough. The real conversation must be about the underlying causes of this war. So, on this question of peacekeepers, as far as I could see, the Russians have gone out of their way clearly and conclusively to slam the door shut. Again, it's strange that this topic hasn't quite got through in London and Paris, or perhaps it has. Perhaps, as Lavrov rightly says, the whole thing is really all about prolonging the war. It's about trying to involve the Americans in the war, to try to keep the Americans committed to the war by trying to get them once again to provide some kind of guarantee to support European peacekeepers. And, well, one way or the other, the Russians have said that they won't accept it. This isn't something that they will agree to, and that, as far as they're concerned, this issue is closed or does not exist. And there's been a good article about this, well, partly good article about this, in, of all places, the Daily Telegraph. It says that the Europeans still seem to be trying to use this topic to try to involve the Americans involved in some way in the Ukrainian conflict. They want to recommit the Americans to the Ukrainian conflict. This article, which I should say is by Daniel De Petris. Europe couldn't replace the US in Ukraine, even if it wanted to. Macron and Starmer should end their futile ploy to trick Trump into guaranteeing Kiev's security. That's the subtitle. And this is what it's all about. And he says, before embarking on his first trip to the White House since Donald Trump returned to power, French President Macron huddled with UK Prime Minister Starmer and came up with a common position. The Europeans were willing to put tens of thousands of their troops in Ukraine after a truce is struck with Russia. The plan would involve the deployment of a 30,000 strong European force concentrated in multiple Ukrainian cities behind the ceasefire lines and rely on the United States to serve as a so-called backstop to make it a more credible deterrent in the eyes of the Russians. Macron pushed this point repeatedly in his meetings in Washington this week. The French president even appeared to try to bounce Trump into becoming part of his scheme. It didn't work. Trump merely restated his position that a peace settlement is needed to be negotiated as soon as possible. I think this is absolutely correct. And now this brings me to the news that broke yesterday, which is about the reports which have appeared in the Financial Times that the Ukrainians have agreed to sign a minerals deal with the United States and that Zelensky might be traveling to Washington to sign it on Friday. Now, the Ukrainians up to now have categorically refused to sign a minerals deal with the United States, provided it contains security guarantees. But the mineral deal that the Financial Times has seen, which, contrary to what the Financial Times is insinuating, doesn't seem to be that different from the deal that was originally proposed by J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio and Mr. Bassent to Ukraine. It's a little less tough on the Ukrainians, but against that, the Ukrainians could always have pushed back and negotiated better terms, and that would have been a negotiation, and it's the kind of thing that the Americans probably would have worked with and wouldn't have caused much acrimony. The reason why Zelensky got angry with Bassent and apparently started to shout at him, and the reason that Zelensky refused to put his signature to the mineral deal when it was presented to him by Rubio and Vance at the Munich Security Conference was that it did not include security guarantees for Ukraine by the United States. That was what Zelensky himself said. And we go back in time to the way in which Zelensky has always presented the idea of the mineral deal. He first floated it with Lindsey Graham, as I remember, in the summer. He then discussed it with Donald Trump at Trump Tower in September. He then brought it up again in his victory plan. The point about the mineral deal is that it was always intended to be a trade for future assistance and pledges of security by the United States, which in Zelensky's victory plan included immediate NATO entry. This is what Zelensky was calling for. What happened, and I've discussed this in many programs, is that Zelensky found that Donald Trump wanted the mineral deal, but was not prepared to provide the security guarantees. And that appeared to be the deal breaker. Well, the deal that the Financial Times has been shown contains no reference to security guarantees. This is what the Financial Times, which has seen the deal, says. And that then begs the question of why, given the fact that the Ukrainians were insisting that there should be security guarantees in connection to this deal, why the Ukrainians dropped that demand. Well, it's obvious that the Americans were getting increasingly angry and were complaining about the fact that the Ukrainians were not proceeding with a mineral deal that they had first floated. And of course, we had those angry posts by Donald Trump on Truth Social, in which he called Zelensky a dictator and a failed comedian, or rather a moderately successful comedian and somebody who was destroying his country. That was last week. And what then happened And there's been a few reports about this in the British media, but not many. But it's clear that this is what happened. Zelensky then got a call from his old friend, Boris Johnson, who told Zelensky, in spite of the fact that the Americans are not providing you with security guarantees now, agree to the minerals deal and sign it. And then, once you've signed it, then start to try to get the Americans to move towards providing you with security guarantees. And it's all clearly set out in the Financial Times, which has seen, as I said, been provided with the draft agreement, the draft minerals agreement, by the Ukrainians, and which has been talking to Ukrainian officials. The agreement omits any reference to US security guarantees, which Kiev had originally insisted on in return for agreeing to the deal. It also leaves crucial questions such as the size of the US stake in the fund, I'm not going to get into the details of that, and the terms of the joint ownership deals to be hashed out in follow-up agreements. Ukrainian officials said that the deal had been approved by the Justice, Economy and Foreign Ministers and held out the prospect of Zelensky travelling to the White House in the coming weeks for a signing ceremony with Trump. And then they go on to say that once the deal has been signed, they presume and expect that security guarantees will follow. Ukrainian officials added that the deal was just a framework agreement and that no revenues would change hands until the fund was in place, allowing them time to iron out any potential disagreements. And Zelensky's government will also have to have time to seek approval from Ukraine's parliament, so there's going to be a whole business of trying to get this sorted. And then we're told by the Financial Times that the Ukrainians expect that as a result of this deal, the Ukrainians will have to some extent intertwined the United States with themselves. They'll have got the Americans investing in Ukraine, and then over time security guarantees from the United States will come. Although the text lacks explicit security guarantees, the officials argued that they had negotiated far more favourable terms and depicted the deal as a way of broadening the relationship with the United States to shore up Ukraine's prospects after 3 years of war. The minerals agreement is only part of the picture. We have heard multiple times in the US administration that it's part of a bigger picture. And sure enough, today, the Ukrainian Prime Minister, Mr. Shmyhal, went forward and said that as far as Ukraine is concerned, the minerals deal is linked to security guarantees. Apparently he didn't say from whom, but anyway, it's clear what the intention is. Get a signature, get a signing ceremony with Donald Trump, then spin it out. No money will actually flow to the Americans until the differences are ironed out. There'll be a process to put this thing through the parliament, the Ukrainian parliament. There might be pushback, supposedly, from some of the MPs there, and eventually lead the Americans by the nose into offering Ukraine security guarantees. This is clearly what this whole device is all about, and it's not that different from what the British and the French are trying to do as well. And again, you can see the fertile mind of Boris Johnson behind all of this, and I'm going to suggest that quite plausibly Boris Johnson has been talking to people in Whitehall within the British government, and that this has been discussed by him and them, and this was what prompted his call to Zelensky, because Johnson is known to have some influence with Zelensky, and this is how we've had these announcements yesterday that a breakthrough with the minerals deal is on its way. Now, here one has to wait and see whether the Americans fall for this particular ploy. My guess is that they will sign the deal, the minerals deal with the Ukrainians. There will be a signing ceremony. Trump is talking about this happening on Friday, though notice that the article in the Financial Times spoke about the Ukrainians thinking that this could take weeks. Maybe what we will see is Zelensky coming to Washington on Friday, initialing the document in some way, but that won't be the last word in the matter. We had exactly the same thing with the Istanbul agreement that the Ukrainians negotiated with the Russians back in March, April 2022. The Ukrainians initialed what appeared to be an approved draft, and the Financial Times has told us that this particular deal is also no more than an apparently approved draft. But then, just as happened with Istanbul, the Ukrainians can say, well, it's not really been completed, we haven't yet decided everything, we still need the security guarantees, we want them from the United States. They can play the same game that they played with the Russians after the signing of the Istanbul agreements in April 2022. In that particular case, the objective was to get the Russians to withdraw their forces from outside Kiev, which the Russians proceeded to do. We will see whether the Americans fall for it this time and actually give the Ukrainians some types of security guarantees. My guess is no. I think that Trump is very alive to these maneuvers, and even if he is not, some of the people in his entourage, Elon Musk, who clearly doesn't like Zelensky at all, and J.D. Vance, who has also spoken about Zelensky needing to hurry up and begin negotiations with the Russians without any further delay. I think that they will be explaining to Donald Trump, if he needs their advice, that this is simply unworkable, that what the Ukrainians are doing is that they're playing a game with the Americans. I would add that it is a very dangerous game to play. The Americans could at some point finally decide that enough is enough and not just cut off aid to Ukraine. I understand that aid to Ukraine is now all but cut off. At least American aid is. The Americans could finally decide that, but they could also decide that from this point on, Ukraine is no longer a friendly country, that it's tried to play the United States, and I can actually see how this could poison what remains of an already very difficult relationship between the Americans and the Ukrainians. Anyway, there we are. This is where I think we are today. Yesterday, we had those maneuvers in the United Nations, which showed the Russians and the Americans working together. We now have confirmation that there's going to be this follow-up meeting between the Americans and the Russians in Istanbul. The Americans and the Russians are pressing forward with the normalization of their relationship. Donald Trump, I understand, has made further comments about how from this point onwards the Americans are not going to be providing any more significant assistance to Ukraine or even any assistance at all, that the burden for this must now fall on the Europeans, and I suspect that the Americans are going to stick to this position. Donald Trump has in the past spoken about how Zelensky comes along to Washington, always comes away with tens of billions of dollars. I think that he's somebody who's probably already formed his own views of Zelensky. And just as he didn't allow Macron to fool him into commitments he didn't want to make, long-term security commitments he didn't want to make, so when Zelensky comes along, he won't allow that to happen either. Of course, before Zelensky comes, Trump is going to meet someone else, and that is the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, who is meeting Trump apparently tomorrow. And essentially, as far as I can see, Starmer is coming along trying to get the Americans to make the same commitments that Emmanuel Macron tried to do on Monday. I'm not sure why the British believe that they can succeed where Macron failed, but hope, as they say, springs eternal. Maybe Starmer will come up with rather more detailed proposals about the British troops that are going to be deployed to Ukraine. I don't know, as part of a ceasefire. But it is important to stress again that this whole issue of deploying European troops to Ukraine is hypothetical. It assumes that there will be a ceasefire. The Russians have flatly rejected the idea of a ceasefire. That is what Lavrov again said. As far as the Russians are concerned, the only purpose of a ceasefire is for the Europeans and the Western powers to rearm the Ukrainians, and they're not in the slightest bit interested in that happening. And, well, Lavrov said that everybody seems to agree that the Russians and the Ukrainians must both agree on the deployment of peacekeeping forces in Ukraine. And, well, the Russians don't agree, notwithstanding certain comments that Trump made over the course of the press conference with Macron, which appeared to imply that they did. Now, I've been reading Trump's words on that particular point about Putin supposedly having told Trump that he didn't object to European peacekeeping forces in Ukraine. I suspect that Trump either misunderstood Putin, which is unlikely, or is again deliberately clouding the issue by conflating the question of Ukraine's ultimate EU membership. The Russian position has been up to now, and it was the position at the meeting in Istanbul, that while Russia adamantly rejects Ukrainian membership of NATO, Russia does not object to Ukrainian membership of the EU, because the EU, unlike NATO, is not a military alliance, but is merely an economic association. I said that I got the impression over the last couple of months that the Russians are gradually shifting from that position. And, by the way, certain words of Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, made after the conversation between Putin and Trump, also makes me think that the Russian position on prospective EU membership of Ukraine is also shifting as well, and is gradually becoming more negative. Now, Peskov's words were originally reported by the official TASS news agency, but I noticed that the TASS dispatch reporting Peskov's words has disappeared. And I wonder whether that might be because the Western media reported those words as implying that Russia still backed Ukraine's EU membership. In fact, as we will see, Peskov's words were more qualified than people have noticed. And here I should just make a quick point that I've come to the realization over many years that Russian statements need to be read in full, and that the Russians are very, very careful in their choice of words. They're frankly pedantic about the various comments that they make. So what Peskov actually said is that about joining the European Union, Peskov said this is the sovereign right of any country. You are talking about integration and economic integration processes. And here, of course, no one can dictate anything to any country, and we are not going to do that. So that looks fine. That implies that the Russians do not object to Ukraine joining the EU. But then Peskov added this: Russia's position is different when it comes to Ukraine joining military alliances. There is a completely different position, of course, on the security-related issues related to defense or military alliances. Now, the point here is that, of course, the EU is evolving. 20 years ago, you could argue, up to a point, that it was, in fact, essentially an economic association. It was already, I must say, especially after the Lisbon Treaty, acquiring increasingly a political character. But, say, 20 years ago, you could say still that it was mostly an economic association. Well, over the last 3 years, and especially over the last few weeks, especially so over the last few weeks, but to some extent over the last few years, the EU has started to change. We increasingly hear about a security and defence dimension to the EU. There's now growing talk about floating an EU fund of 700 billion euros, possibly backed by euro bonds, to provide for defence spending across the EU. Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, has changed the rules so that EU structural funds can be used by member states for defence spending. So the EU is starting to develop some of the defence and military and security related aspects that Peskov says is objectionable. Now, it is not an outright reversal of position. The Russians are not saying that they are opposed on principle to Ukraine joining the EU. But it is a more nuanced statement of support than the one we saw at the time of the Istanbul Agreement in April 2022. And it strengthens my view that the Russians are slowly, very gradually shifting their position on this question as they see the EU acquire a military dimension and begin to evolve. Now, in theory, there are mechanisms that could be brought into play to allow Ukraine to join the EU, even if the EU were to acquire more of a military and security dimension. Austria, for example, is a member of the EU, but it resiles from all sorts of provisions within the various EU treaties that do have security and military related dimensions, because these would contradict the terms of the Austrian State Treaty of 1955, which, by agreement with the Soviet Union and the United States, had declared Austria to be a neutral country. So in theory, you could see how Ukraine might negotiate a deal similar to Austria's. However, how would that happen? Would Ukraine be bringing up all of these proposals as it negotiated with the EU? Would the Russians insist on being involved in the negotiations with the EU about Ukraine's EU membership? I cannot imagine the EU ever agreeing to any of that. So I don't want to suggest, as I said, that the door on Russia supporting Ukraine's EU membership has slammed shut. But step slowly, very, very gradually, it seems to me it is beginning to close. And again, it pays, it absolutely does pay, to read the statements, the comments that Russian officials like Peskov make very carefully. Now, anyway, there we go. This is where we stand at the moment. We will see what happens with the mineral deal over the next couple of days, whether Zelensky does indeed turn up in Washington on Friday, what exactly it is that he signs, and to repeat again, when the Ukrainians talk about a framework work deal, in a sense, it's just a sheet of paper and might mean, in practice, very little at all. It all sounds very, very vague. We might, in fact, quite plausibly see the Ukrainians string out the matter for weeks and months as they try to cajole the Americans into giving security guarantees. And as I said, we need to wait and see what the Americans are going to do in response to all of that. Now, there are a few further things I do want to say. The first is that the most important dynamic behind this whole process, the thing that is changing everything in the way in which this process is playing out, is the steady westward advance of the Russian army and its tightening grip on the remaining Ukrainian fortified positions in Donbas, Pokrovsk in the west, Konstantinovka, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk in the center, and also in Kursk region outside the Donbas, further to the north. I will discuss all of this shortly. It's the Russian advance that has changed the entire diplomatic, political and military calculus. This, of course, has happened alongside the success of the Russian economy in absorbing the sanctions shock. The Western powers did not expect that Russia would be able to withstand the sanctions shock after it was applied in the spring of 2022. It has come as a deep surprise and disappointment to them that it has done, and it buried their hopes of a political crisis in Moscow and a possible change of regime there, and the forced ouster from power of President Putin. And the same applies ultimately to the military calculus as well. Now, I want to just here address one particular piece of mythology. As far as I can see, it is mythology that I see repeatedly brought up. This is that the Russians, when they advanced into Ukraine in February 2022, conducted a blitzkrieg and expected and assumed that the whole of Ukraine would collapse in the face of their advance within 2 to 3 weeks, with Kiev itself falling in 3 days. Now, a lot of people thought that might happen, but I don't remember a single Russian official, not President Putin, no member of the Russian government, no Russian military official at that time talking in that way. I absolutely do not remember President Putin speaking about Kiev falling in 3 days. when he announced the goals of the special military operation. He set out what those goals were: the securing of Donbas, of the two independent republics of the Donbas. The Russians had just recognized their independence and had come to an agreement with them, and it was the agreement with the two Donbas republics that, according to the Russians, justified their intervention because they were taking steps to defend the two Donbas republics from what they claimed was an imminent Ukrainian attack. And by the way, they might have had some cause to think that. As I remember, the Security Council meeting that took place just before that decision was made was deeply concerned with the possibility of an attack on Donbas. Anyway, in addition to protecting Donbas, the Russians did also announce certain other objectives, or Putin did. One was that Ukraine should be a neutral state. The second was that there should be denuclearization, demilitarization, and also denazification. In other words, that Ukraine should lose its capability to acquire nuclear weapons, that its military should be reduced significantly in size so that it could neither threaten Donbas nor Crimea nor Russia itself, and lastly, that representatives of the ideology of the 1930s who were rampant in Ukraine and exercised great influence there should be brought to heel, and all of the laws and regulations and rules that they had applied should be reversed. Well, those objectives presuppose a continued existence for Ukraine. Just saying. And as I also remember, on the 24th of February, the day when the special military operation began, Putin had a meeting in the Kremlin with the leader of Azerbaijan, President Aliyev, in which he specifically said that Russia was not seeking to occupy or conquer Ukraine. He didn't mention Kiev, but I don't see why one should omit Kiev. And then a couple of days later, there was another meeting which Putin attended, also I believe in the Kremlin, in which he spoke to airline pilots and people of that kind who were troubled about the fact that the Western powers had established sanctions preventing repairs of Western aircraft flown by Russian airlines. And Putin was then asked by those pilots and those airline staff why, if the objective of the operation was merely to defend Donbas, the military aspect of the operation was merely to defend Donbas, did the Russian military reach out further and expand far beyond it? And Putin gave an explanation. He said that this had been done on the advice of the Russian General Staff. The Russian General Staff had said that if the Russian military did not take action in territories that extended beyond Donbas, then the Ukrainians would simply reinforce their front lines in Donbas. And though the Russians might push them back, well, the Ukrainians would still have further front lines to fall back to, and that would simply mean that the Russians had just pushed the Ukrainians back a certain distance, but not achieved the security for Donbas that was their objective. That was what Putin said then. And then about 2 weeks later, the operations chief of the Russian General Staff, General Rudskoy, issued a further report. This is in March 2022, in which he again addressed the specific question of why were Russian troops located near Chernigov, Sumy, and all of these places, Kharkiv, and did they have any plan to attack these places, to storm these places? And General Rudskoy said that while the Russians might eventually do that, that was not their objective. what they were doing was pinning Ukrainian forces down, causing them to focus on the defense of these cities, whilst the Russian army focused on conducting the major operation, which was to secure Donbas. So that was what the Russians were actually saying in February, March 2022. Now, all I will say is I have never seen any report that the Russians intended to capture Kiev within 3 days. I've never seen any report from a Russian source, from a Russian official source, that the Russians were doing that. As I remember, on the contrary, the Russians were negotiating with the Ukrainians and began to negotiate with the Ukrainians the day after the special military operation began. There were meetings in Gomel, in Belarus, and then, of course, the meetings were transferred to Istanbul, and negotiations continued, just saying, and ended up with the Istanbul agreement. If people want to insist on this claim that the Russian objective in February, March 2022 was indeed to capture Kiev within 3 days and to occupy the whole of Ukraine, then I think it would be helpful if they could provide some citations, some actual citations by Russian officials at the time, which said things like this, because I don't recall any such comments being made. And whenever I see these assertions made today, I follow the links, and they always lead to other articles and comments by Western commentators or publications. They never actually cite any official Russian ones. Just saying. Now, just to quickly say, what Putin said to the airline staff in March 2022, and what General Rutskoy said a little while later about the Russians pinning down the Ukrainians in places like Kharkiv, Chernigov, Sumy, and all the rest, might have been true. But the Russians themselves negated all of that when Putin took the decision, at the request, according to him, of the Western powers, to withdraw all the Russian forces from all of these cities because he thought that the Istanbul Agreement had been agreed. So there we go. I mean, it was somewhat different, according to the Russians, than what we hear from the West. Now, all of that brings me back to my key point. The Western powers, whatever they might have expected to happen in Ukraine in the spring of 2022, and I do not believe, by the way, that they seriously thought that Ukraine would be overrun by the Russians in just a few weeks. Whatever it was that they thought then, the Western powers have spent much of the time since then arming Ukraine. And, of course, in 2023, they prepared with the Ukrainians the famous counteroffensive that the Ukrainians launched to try to break through to the Sea of Azov and to the Black Sea. And by the way, an aspect of the summer 2023 offensive that never gets mentioned, to recapture the bitterly contested town of Bakhmut, which the Russians had just captured a few weeks before. And that offensive completely failed. The Russians comprehensively defeated it. And the West, neither the West nor the Ukrainians, at any point since then, have been able to come up with a coherent plan, a coherent military plan, as to how they're going to achieve military victory or any kind of victory over the Russians. What we have instead is continued dribbles of military assistance to Ukraine. This has continued throughout 2024. The European powers continue to supply Ukraine in 2025. But there's never been any coherent strategy for military victory. Apparently, as we read in the New York Times a few weeks ago, back in April 2024, there was a discussion in Washington where Ukrainian intelligence officials attended, and they reported to the people that they were meeting in what seems to have been a high-level conference that Ukraine seemed likely to lose the war if it continued in the same conventional way. And it was agreed that asymmetrical approaches should in future be followed. And we've seen that with the big Ukrainian drone attacks across Russia. One occurred last night, by the way. From what I understand, from what the Russians are saying, of the 120 plus drones that the Ukrainians launched against Russia, the Russians seem to be suggesting that their air defense managed to shoot down every one. Well, that may be true, it may not be true. I'm not going to get into a discussion of this, but it doesn't seem as if any significant damage was done. Anyway, partly there was this asymmetrical attack with drones, which we've seen accelerate since the summer of last year. Then there was the Kursk operation, which I said at the time, more and more people have also come round to this view. The Russians have officially come round to this view. The operation to try to seize the Kursk nuclear power plant, which failed and which instead landed the Ukrainians with a major operational problem of what to do with the territory in Kursk region that they have captured. Anyway, there was these attempts at asymmetrical battles, and we've had more discussions, sporadic discussions about trying to tighten the sanctions on Russia, even though it's clear that that leads nowhere. And of course, there have also been all sorts of attempts at diplomatically isolating the Russians. We've had peace conferences starting in Copenhagen and the last one in Switzerland, all of which were supposed to put together a consensus behind Zelensky's peace proposal, which is a proposal for Russia's outright capitulation. And, well, those people who are now bitterly complaining about the fact that Ukraine and the European Union, the European powers, are being excluded from the discussions between the Americans and the Russians, which, to stress again, are principally about bilateral matters. It's clear that there is no discussion yet of some kind of peace agreement between the Americans and the Russians. The Americans do not have a plan. Their plan is to get the Ukrainians and the Russians to sit down and talk to each other. The Russians have said yes. The Ukrainians say maybe, perhaps, but only if the Americans give them all of the various things that, if the Ukrainians were given, would enable them to continue the war. Anyway, we've had all of these peace talks, all those agreements, all those conferences. We've had further attempts to tighten sanctions. We've had supplies of weapons. We've had missile strikes inside Russia. But there has never been any clear plan, any plan at all, in fact, since the failure of the summer 2023 offensive. No plan for victory. Instead, it is the Russians who have continued advancing. And it is this failure, this fact of the Russian advance, incremental, and relentless as it has been, which has forced the Americans towards talks with the Russians. Donald Trump has played his role. The previous administration was far too invested in the previous failed strategy to give it up. But it is military failure and sanctions failure in Ukraine which has obliged the United States to change its approach. The failure of the previous administration, of all its various plans, its military plans, its sanctions plans, to achieve the result that they wanted. So this is, as I said, the major reason why the Americans and the Russians are sitting down and talking to each other at this time. Now, there is a further school of thought, and this is an entirely correct one, which is that the Americans want to transfer their energy and resources to contesting China in the Asia Pacific. About that, I think fundamentally there is no doubt at all. Some officials in the American government, probably Donald Trump himself, sees this more in terms of economic rivalry, but others within the administration most emphatically do have a security-related concerns and will indeed continue to put pressure on East Asian states to align with the United States against the Russians. And it is also true that because the Americans want to do that, they want to distance themselves. They want to draw down, to close down this project in Ukraine, which the previous administration launched and which has obviously failed. It has failed to defeat the Russians militarily. It has failed to crush them economically. And it is absolutely true that the Americans are now telling the Europeans, if you want to continue with this conflict, then it's up to you to pick up the slack. The Europeans are being asked to come forward and to provide whatever military assistance that Ukraine wants, whatever security guarantees Ukraine wants, whatever peacekeeping forces Ukraine wants. It's absolutely correct that the Americans are openly speaking about the Europeans taking over the burden from them as the Americans focus on China. Now, Donald Trump actually, according to the very latest reports I've seen, has said this again. He has actually said, apparently over the last couple of hours, that the United States is not going to go on giving support to Ukraine. That is for the Europeans to do. The problem is that the Europeans cannot do it. They don't have the resources. They are limited by the small size of their armies, their fragmented military industrial complex, in what they can realistically do. If I go back to that article by Daniel De Petris in the Daily Telegraph, he says it quite straightforwardly. Europe couldn't replace the United States in Ukraine even if it wanted to. So the choice ultimately comes down to this. Either some kind of peace settlement is negotiated between now and whenever it is that Ukraine collapses. And there's an article, I believe it was in the Wall Street Journal, which says that the Russia weapons that the United States sent to Ukraine in the last weeks of the Biden administration will start to run out sometime in the summer. This, by the way, corresponds closely with what Kirill Budanov said a few weeks ago, that Ukraine has until the summer, it can keep fighting until the summer, but then problems will begin to start to increase, and then basically it will be curtains. That was what Kirill Budanov said. So the Ukrainians can keep fighting with the weapons the Americans have provided them until the summer, but they can't really go on resisting to the extent that they are now. Beyond that, and of course, as article after article in the American media also says, they are running out of men on the battlefronts. Their brigades are heavily depleted. They cannot keep fighting in the way that they previously could. And these problems will steadily and cumulatively grow. Well, either you come to an agreement to prevent that happening, or if there is a collapse, and if the Americans stick to their position that they're not going to go on supplying Ukraine with weapons of which the United States is already in short supply. It may have an abundance of weapons by comparison with any European state, but it needs all the weapons it can get to confront China in the Pacific, which has, to repeat again, a military industrial capacity that is much greater than America's own. Either the Americans, if the Americans stick to that position, that it's for the Europeans to carry the burden, then of course if there is a collapse, if we have a Saigon moment in Kiev, the Americans could say it's because the Europeans failed in this project. The Americans did all that they could, but ultimately it was the Ukrainians who wouldn't make peace and the Europeans who didn't have the resources or failed to come up with the resources to support them. And I think that is the American strategy. I don't think one should look too far beyond this to try to understand what the Americans are doing. As Putin said in his interview yesterday, to the extent that he can, Trump is trying to save Ukraine. He's trying to save Ukraine by getting a negotiation going between the Ukrainians and the Russians, which will secure a peace. If that fails to happen, then it's up to the Ukrainians and the Europeans. And if that doesn't work, and if the Russians win, then it will be their fault, not America's and not Donald Trump's. That's, in my opinion, the entire explanation of the actions that the Americans are taking. You don't need to look for plans, detailed plans and projects and that kind of thing in order to understand what Donald Trump and his people are about. It serves American interests. It might not serve Ukrainian ones, or it might not serve the interests of the Kiev regime. But you can see what it is that the Americans are trying to do. And as for the Ukrainians and the Europeans, they, of course, are as invested in Project Ukraine as the Biden people were. By the way, I should make it clear, when I talk about Project Ukraine, I don't mean the country and the nation of Ukraine. I mean for the project that the Americans and the Europeans both started out with in 2022, the defeat, or as Lloyd Austin put it, the weakening of Russia. The Europeans and, of course, the Kiev regime remain as committed to Project Ukraine as always, and that's why we see all of these maneuvers to try to keep the Americans still involved, try to persuade the Americans to give guarantees for the European peacekeepers, which Macron tried to extract from Trump on Monday, and this sleight of hand that the Ukrainians are playing with the minerals deal, in which they're trying to draw the Americans into a minerals deal, which they hope eventually will get the United States back involved in Ukraine and giving Ukraine security guarantees. So this is, in my opinion, the game that is being currently played. It will be important to see whether or not the Trump people are able to navigate around it, and at the same time, without causing a complete rupture in the NATO alliance, which I think they would obviously prefer to avoid, whether the Trump people can navigate around it whilst simultaneously repairing the relationship with Russia, at least to the point where American and Russian leaders can communicate and talk to each other again. And that is the purpose of the meeting in Istanbul. And Peskov, by the way, even as I've been making this program, has now come out and said that the Americans and the Russians are indeed now working on preparing for a summit meeting between Putin and Trump, though he didn't say how soon that meeting would take place. So this is what I wanted to say. Now, I'm going to turn briefly to the topic of the military situation on the Ukrainian battlefields. And I'm going to say a few things quickly, which is that it seems to me that there's again a narrative that has gained strength, which is that the Russians have somehow slowed down over the last couple of weeks. I can't myself see any evidence of this at all. It is true that the Russians have not made an attempt so far to try to capture Pokrovsk in the western end of the contact line. Like many people, I assumed back in the summer that Pokrovsk was their immediate objective. But in fact, the Russians have been focused more so far on capturing the territory to the south of Pokrovsk. First Selidovo and Kurakhovo, which they captured some weeks ago rather. They've recently essentially extinguished the Andreevka fortified area to the southwest of Kurakhovo. There was a report yesterday that the Ukrainian troops have pulled out of the one village left there, which is Constantinople. We're likely to get reports probably in a couple of days that the Russians have taken complete control of it. The Russians are also pushing westwards from Velikaya Novosilka, and there are lots of reports that the Russians are gradually now starting to move in Zaporozhye region, ultimately towards the city of Zaporozhye. And one can see how the Russian advance for Velikaya Novosilka and the Russian recapture, which apparently has now been informally confirmed, of the village of Pyatikhatki, all fits together with the picture of the Russian advance towards the Dnieper River and ultimately towards Zaporozhye. At some point, the Russians will want to capture Pokrovsk, but I think that for the moment, it is these advances in the south, the clearing of all of this territory in the south, and the destruction of the Ukrainian forces south of Pokrovsk, which is their major objective. I used to say, and it still remains the case, that the way to understand what has been going on in southwest Donbas is to think of it as one great battle, one that extended from Krasnogorovka in the east to Ugledar in the south, that encompassed Velikaya Novosilka and Kurakhovo and Selidovo and ultimately Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk is the last piece of this that the Russians will probably take once they have captured all of the rest and conclusively defeated the Ukrainian forces there, which, from what I can see, they are very close to doing now. It seems that west of Velikaya Novosilka, Ukrainian resistance is disorganized and rather weak, and with the loss of the Andreevka fortified area, it's probably fairly weak as well. Now, there continues to be a difficult battle for the Russians in Chasiv Yar, but again, yesterday, as it happens, the Russians claimed that they'd made significant advances around Chasiv Yar, that they'd advanced another 2 kilometers, and of course, we have the Ukrainian claims, which I suspect are principally intended to muddle the picture and to make it seem as if things are not as bad for the Ukrainians as they actually are. So a couple of days ago, we had an article in the Daily Telegraph which implied that the Battle of Toretsk was still underway. And then yesterday we got the reports of a Ukrainian counterattack which had supposedly recaptured parts of Toretsk and had reached the stadium there. And today also, by the way, I saw in the Kiev Independent that the Ukrainians are claiming to have captured the village of Kotlino, southwest of Pokrovsk. Now, about Kotlino, I've had absolutely no reason to believe that that is true. On the contrary, my understanding is that all the Ukrainian attacks in that area have failed. Just saying. I don't know. And Kotlino is not that important anyway, just to make this clear. But as for the attacks on Toretsk, it seems to me that this is essentially an attempt to make that Daily Telegraph article true, to carry out raids into Toretsk, to try to recapture some buildings there, to publish some videos of Ukrainian troops in Toretsk, to make it seem as if there is still a battle in Toretsk that's going on. These attacks, these counterattacks, which we often see from the Ukrainians. I remember one going all the way back to the spring of 2022, when the Ukrainians were claiming that they'd carried out a successful counterattack in, I think it was Lysychansk, which it turned out was largely imaginary. All of these claims of successful Ukrainian counterattacks, it seems to me, are more based upon narrative construction rather than anything else. Everywhere else, in every other place, the Russians continue their advances, and we see that these Ukrainian counterattacks, when they do occur, have a purely ephemeral quality. The major crisis, military crisis that Ukraine appears to be facing now, it must be said, however, is not on the line of contact, but in Kursk region. Now, over the last few days or hours perhaps, we've had some reports about the situation in Kursk region, and there are reports that the Russians have captured the village of Pogrebki. In fact, it's not reports, Group of Forces North say that they have. The village of Pogrebki and the village of Orlovka, both of which are located just north of that long contested village of Malaya Loknia, which is basically the remaining Ukrainian defense point just north of Sudzha, the main point of defense of the Ukrainians in Sudzha. Now, Group of Forces North are also saying that they're now fighting, there's now heavy fighting going on in the village of Lebyedivka, which is located to the northeast of Sverlikovo, which the Russians captured a few days ago. And there are also reports that the Russians have captured the village of Kurilovka, which is located to the south of Sudzha, not far from the villages of Cherkaskaya, Konopielka and Makhnovka, which the Russians also claim to have captured some days ago. There are also claims which are very difficult to verify about a significant Russian presence now in Kharkiv region, though it's very difficult to get a clear idea of where it is. But some Russian reports, official Russian reports, seem to imply that the weight of the battle in this area has moved from Kursk region to Sumy region, and that the Russians have now established fire control, as it is called, over the main highway from Sumy, the city of Sumy, to Suja, which remains the main Ukrainian defense point inside Kursk. Now, if all of these reports are true, and I've no doubt that Pogrebki has indeed been captured and Orlovka has also been captured, then I have to say that claims that the Ukrainian salient in Kursk region is around 40% of its original size overestimate the territory that the Ukrainians still control. It seems to me that effectively what we're seeing in Kursk region is a small salient made up of a few villages around Suja itself, basically a few villages to the north of Suja. If Lebyedivka is captured by the Russians, well, and the Russians push south from Orlovka and capture the villages of Novaya Sorochina. There's some reports that they have already, by the way. Who knows? And Malaya Lochnia, which they control for some time, but apparently no longer do. Anyway, if that happens, then essentially all that will be left is Suja itself, another village called Kazachya Lochnia, which is located immediately to the north of Suja, and Martinovka on the main road to Kursk, which the Russians have sometimes marched into and sometimes marched out of, but which I'm going to assume is under Ukrainian control, at least for the moment. And if it is also true that the Russians now have fire control over the main supply road, then the position of the Ukrainian troops in Suja is straightforwardly very bad. They're not in a cauldron yet. Supplies can still reach them. Even fire control doesn't prevent a road being used. Vehicles can still rush along it at high speeds and sometimes get through. And there are also country roads which the Ukrainians can also use to keep their garrison in Suja supplied, though obviously to a lesser extent than previously. But the position of the Ukrainians in Kursk region would become increasingly difficult from the perspective of logistics. And, well, the Russians might slowly tighten their pincers anyway. And it's highly likely that in time, in 2 or 3 weeks maybe, or a month, we would indeed see a cauldron around Suja. Small place, very difficult to defend, I suspect, surrounded on all sides at that point by the Russians. It would be dooming the Ukrainian troops to a terrible fate unless they were withdrawn. Now, there were some scattered reports on the Russian side of the internet yesterday that the Ukrainians are indeed, in fact, now preparing to evacuate Suja. I think that most unlikely. Zelensky has made this an issue of pride to hold on to Suja and to some territory inside Russia. If Suja were abandoned to the Russians, it would be a massive blow to his prestige. It would call into question the entire Kursk operation, as it deserves to be, by the way. And, well, it might precipitate the political crisis in Kiev that the Americans would also probably like to see. And of course, if Zelensky plays the game that I think he's going to play over the minerals deal, that will probably harden feeling in Washington that this man is impossible and has to be removed. So we could see major events play out in Kursk over the next couple of weeks. And if they do play out there, they could start to have an effect in Ukraine itself, in Kiev itself, and whatever ephemeral counterattacks the Ukrainians are conducting in the meantime. It's not going to attract much interest if, after all that has happened, they lose Suja. Well, that's the point where I am going to go. That's where I'm going to end today's program. So far, Donald Trump, as I said, has, to say it simply, he's run rings around the Europeans and the Ukrainians. They continue to play their game of trying to draw him in, to trying to keep him continue to commit the United States to an open-ended support for Ukraine. He clearly doesn't want to do that, nor do the officials of his administration. The story of the European peacekeepers looks like it's probably coming to an end, and I suspect that Trump is not going to allow the minerals deal to bait him into doing that either. But it depends on him at the end of the day and his administration, and we will have to see how it all plays out. Well, this is where I finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.